Okay, so we've talked about power, we've talked about morality. Let's talk a little bit about international relations now. This lecture is largely going to serve as a recap of what you should have learned already in international politics and theories of international relations. I'll offer a couple of remarks over how international relations theory and morality might overlap, but for the most part, this material should be familiar enough to you. So we're talking about international relations, but what relations really are we talking about? Who are the actors, right? Strictly speaking, I think we'll be talking mostly about interstate relations and transnational relations. Interstate relations are relations between states or governments. Transnational relations admits of a variety of actors operating across borders, like non-governmental organizations, like NGOs, well, called NGOs, businesses, individuals, interstate organizations, like, for instance, Interpol, supranational organizations like the European Union, for example. So all of these would qualify as transnational relations. So international relations really hides a whole variety of different kinds of actors relating with one another. Sometimes it pays to be more specific, at other times international relations is just fine. Theories of international relations are largely supposed to be explanations of interstate conduct, or why transnational actors behave the way they do. Now, each of these main theories may be useful when trying to explain any given phenomenon. That is to say, we don't have to be wedded to one. And in some cases, explaining certain kinds of outcomes, more than one may be useful. We might appeal to 2 or 3 different theories in order to gain a comprehensive explanation of what just happened. So you don't have to adopt one of these or reject the other, but you do need to assign some level of explanatory power to each in any given situation. So you might say 50% of what happens can be explained by realism, 40% by liberal institutionalism, and maybe 10% by constructivism in this case, but in this other case, maybe it's 80% constructivism and 20% realism, or some mixture of the two. You have to be able to say, well, some of these are going to be more heavily weighted in particular cases than others. So the explanations compete at one level, but complement each other on another level. Explanations in international relations also admit of a variety of levels of analysis. There are different levels of analysis, or starting points, or places we can start, right? We could start at the individual level, right, by looking at the psychology of individual leaders or the values of actors. So historians of international relations who look at World War II might start to explain why Germany acted in one way or another by looking at the psychology of Hitler and say, well, Hitler was like this, and so therefore he drove Germany to behave in this way. In addition to psychology, an individual level variable might be the values of actors. So you might look at what political parties and ideologies actors are serving. So when looking at communist countries, for example, you might look at the leaders. It would be probably wise to look at the values of leaders, in particular thinking about how the behavior of these states might advance the ideology of communism. Now, I'm not saying that's the right way to look at it. It might just be that communism was a cover for other kinds of motives, or that communist states, just like capitalist states, had to respond to systemic pressures from the international environment. But what I'm saying is that if you're looking at the individual level, that's the sort of thing you're looking at. Okay. In addition to the individual level, you might look at the domestic level. You might look particularly at domestic political and economic pressures to explain why countries behaved in a particular sort of way. So if a country, for instance, is losing resources, or is becoming economically stronger, or needs to open up markets for its goods, or needs to find new sources of natural resources, such as, for instance, again, going back to World War II, but it's what's on the top of my head, Germany needed oil to run its war economy. Germany doesn't have any oil, so it needed to capture oil fields, and much of its strategic decision-making, therefore, revolved around trying to secure oil fields in the Caucasus, in Northern Africa, and the Middle East. And its failure to do so was one of the reasons the German war machine grinded to a halt after a certain point. And finally, the systemic level. international economic pressures and strategic pressures may be driving the behavior of states. So for instance, globalization is a kind of systemic pressure, right? The fact that it's just cheaper to buy a whole lot of things abroad than to make them at home is a kind of pressure that domestic consumers will put on states to bring down tariff barriers, or the fact that companies want access to lucrative foreign markets and that they're more competitive in those foreign markets often can be laid at the feet of technology developments driven by globalization. So, of course, realists will look at the pervasive insecurity of the international anarchic environment as a kind of systemic pressure that drives states to arm themselves and to seek power or seek security through power. So let's look at least three main theories. I'm not saying there aren't more, but these are three that are often cited in introductory textbooks. Let's talk first about realism and neo-realism. The readings associated with this in our class, the Morgenthau readings and the reading from Thucydides. Classical realism is organized around a theory of human nature, particularly seeing human nature in rather dark terms. Humans are self-interested and power-driven. They will pursue their own interests whenever they can, and the only thing that will prevent them is a stronger power to restrain them. The consequence of this view of human nature is that participants in anarchic environments like the state of nature, like international society, are constantly at risk from others. They're constantly under threat because everybody around them is self-interested and power-driven. The only way to not be at risk is to therefore accumulate some power of your own so that you can fend off challenges from others. Neo-realism reaches a lot of the same conclusions as realism about the need to get security through power, but makes no real claims about human nature other than human nature tends to be rational. Right? So it doesn't posit that the goals of human nature are particularly self-interested, but that the means through which humans exercise their reason tend to be rational. And so maybe most people are good, but that doesn't really matter at the end of the day what human nature is like. It only takes a few bad apples to spoil international society for the rest. It only takes the threat that someone might want to take advantage of you to destroy the potential for cooperative activities, particularly the building of international institutions. So neo-realism just notes the ever-present potential and fear of violence that characterizes international society. Wars may not be going on at any given time, but the threat of war is always there. Why? Because there's not always, except your own power, there's nothing to stop someone else from invading you. So an example of neo-realist reasoning would be their skepticism of collective security and arrangements, and particularly disarmament treaties, right? So states might all benefit, right, if they were all to disarm together, right? That would be less money spent on weapons and more money spent on things that are more valuable than weapons, and at a reduced level of armament, everyone's still in the same playing field. But there's just fewer weapons, and so everybody's better off. And the potential for destruction, presumably, is lesser. But note that in that situation, in that disarmed situation, any state that arms itself while others are disarmed will reap huge gains. Just because nobody has any weapons doesn't mean the capacity and knowledge to produce weapons has magically disappeared, or even if it has been wiped from the face of the earth, couldn't be rediscovered. Right? So just the knowledge that the state could rearm is potentially problematic for realists and neo-realists. It has nothing to do with people being power hungry. It simply has to do with people being rational and prudent in favor of in the circumstance of a uncertain international environment, an anarchic international environment. Right? Because once one state rearms, then other states will have to rearm in order not to be disadvantaged. And in fact, before anybody rearms, the threat of others potentially rearming will probably be sufficient for a rational state that cares about its people and that cares about its security to preemptively arm itself. And since all states face the same dilemma, it is rational for all to arm themselves. You could see this as a kind of collective action problem or a kind of race to the bottom. So it's the pressures of an anarchic system that lead individual states to seek security through power, not necessarily their individual self-interest. But there are problems with this neo-realist account of international relations because although it certainly explains some of what we observe, like the arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States between the 50s and the 70s, for example, but it really also fails to explain why so many countries invest so little in their militaries. Why is Denmark practically disarmed? Why is the Netherlands, well, Netherlands is a bad example. Why is Denmark practically disarmed? Why is Belgium practically disarmed? We have a lot of countries that spend tiny percentages of their gross domestic product on military forces and and they have a very tiny fraction of their population under arms at any given time. It seems that realism would predict that more countries would be more militarized than they currently are. Instead, it seems that these small countries, particularly small, fairly wealthy European countries, seem to trust that other countries will come to their aid if they are attacked. They seem to rely on treaties in ways that realism and neo-realism would predict they wouldn't. So this calls for an explanation and means that the tool of realism or neo-realism seems not complete. It seems to not explain everything that we observe in international relations. So from there we turn to liberalism and neoliberal institutionalism. Readings in our course that correspond to this sort of approach include Keohane and Kenneth Oy. Liberalism in international relations. I admit that liberalism has different definitions in other contexts, particularly political philosophy, as well as politics in general. Liberalism has a more positive account of human nature in this context. Human beings, on the liberal view, have moral motivations and generally want to cooperate with one another. Treaties and alliances are usually reliable, and international institutions are capable of bringing law and order to the anarchy of international society. Liberals tend to look less towards international systemic pressures and more towards domestic politics and individual values or psychologies when attempting to explain international phenomena. Now, the key here is that individuals and states have choices, and because states and individuals vary in their circumstances and in their psychologies and in their cultures, these states and individuals can make different sorts of choices. Because of the possibility for choice, there is possibility for progress in human affairs, according to liberalism, as people learn over time which choices work and which choices do not. Liberals hold out the possibility that warfare will become a thing of the past, that we could eliminate war from human affairs through careful construction of collective security institutions at the international level. Realists, on the other hand, are very skeptical of this. They really don't think that much changes at a fundamental level. The system does not change. The window dressing might change. The rationales and reasons people offer for what they do might change. But the underlying systemic pressures are going to make communist and capitalist and socialist and monarchic and democratic governments all behave roughly the same way once they hit the international stage, even though they behave very differently when concerned with their own populations. Now, liberal institutionalists, like neo-realists, don't want to talk so much about human nature. Liberals tend to see human nature as fairly positive, realists tend to see human nature as fairly negative, but liberal institutionalists like neo-realists, would rather simply look at the incentives and systems in which states and international actors are operating in order to explain their behavior. So they share a set of assumptions that human beings are more or less rational. Unlike neo-realists, though, neoliberal institutionalists believe that building international institutions can change a state's fundamental incentives for the better. That is to say, self-interest, or a combination of self-interest and unilateral threats by some players in the system will be sufficient to change a state's incentives from non-cooperation to cooperation with the system. So rules backed up by the individual self-interest of their members, who have an interest in obeying the rules, and the threat of sanctions from individual states or groups of states acting together can work in mitigating the anarchy of the international system. But, as always, there are problems. It's not clear to me that self-interest and unilateral threats are enough to constrain the behavior of very powerful states. And we've seen this recently when Russia invaded Crimea and eastern parts of Ukraine, where Georgia also invaded Georgia, without any real regard for international sanctions, rules, human rights, or any of the other constructions that liberal institutionalists have been at pains to tell us will constrain the behavior of states. China, as well, continues to violate human rights without a whole lot of protest from its Western trading partners. In other words, institutions might be a way for large states to exercise power over small states, while powerful states play by very, very different rules. So on that view, that view would be a kind of neo-realist explanations of why institutions arise. They arise to essentially promote the interests of their most powerful members and constrain the least powerful members. It's a cheaper way of exercising force without actually having to go to war or make threats all the time. You just create rules that happen to advantage you, and you ignore those rules when it suits you and when you can. Okay. There's a third view, however, which is called Constructivism, and the readings in your class that correspond to Constructivism would be those by Alexander Wendt and Hurd. Constructivism tries to fill some of the explanatory gaps in liberalism and realism. Both liberalism and realism in their neo-realist or neoliberal variants, or their classical variants, don't do well with some sorts of questions, right? So why is it that states don't use nuclear weapons, for example, especially against non-nuclear states? Non-nuclear states, there's no threat of retaliation, so why is it that states don't do that? Why do states follow rules issued by international institutions even when the rules are not in their interest, right? And why does Switzerland have a navy anyway, when it doesn't have a coastline? These are all sorts of questions that liberals and realists have a difficult time dealing with, but constructivists have come up with a set of answers to that are fairly plausible. Perhaps it's the case that states just don't want to shame themselves in front of international community by using nuclear weapons. So it just might be the case that states feel moral pressure in the way individuals feel moral pressure. There are norms at the international level, and being the first, well, the second, to use nuclear weapons, it would be a kind of taboo, right? And we talk about the nuclear taboo quite a bit. States have had opportunities to use nuclear weapons in warfare since 1945, and they have not. And in each case, it did not seem that there were a whole lot of, well, not each case, but in some of the cases at least, it did not seem to be the case that really bad things would happen if they didn't use nuclear weapons. Now, perhaps it's the case that states believe that some norms are simply right or appropriate, and thus they don't violate them, even when it would be better for them if they did, right? It's also going to, so people believe maybe in a nuclear taboo, and it's appropriate to reject nuclear weapons. Some states have even voluntarily relinquished nuclear weapons, like South Africa, for example. It's also the case, potentially, that states want to emulate other states because there's a shared ideal in international society of what states are supposed to do. So states just mimic one another because they want to be like the most powerful states or the most exemplary states. And, you know, so why does Switzerland have a navy? Because states have navies, right? Powerful states have navies. And if you're landlocked, well, you're just going to have a small navy going around a lake, but you have a navy, and that makes you more state-like, right? So again, states want to emulate one another. They want, other examples might be, why do so many countries have national airlines? It's not clear there's an economic justification. It's not clear that anybody needs an airline, or at least that all states need to have their airline. But many states operate and maintain airlines even at a loss, even when it's not particularly advantageous for them to do so. Once again, these are examples of things that governments do, perhaps simply in order to be more state-like. So let's come back to morality and international relations for a second. Each of these theories predict, I think, a different sort of role for moral choice in international affairs. Constructivism and realism are systemic theories. In these theories, countries face important normative and security pressures to conform to a particular code of conduct. In the case of realism, they need to seek security through power. In the case of constructivism, the idea is that there's powerful norms in the international community that are going to drive the behavior of states, and those norms might be different at different times and places. But in either case, it doesn't look like states have a whole lot of choices in front of them. Powerful countries, though, in these theories may have a little bit more leeway to make choices, a little bit more maneuvering room to influence the character of the system. So seeking security through power sounds simple, but in reality there's a lot of choices that have to be made about how to do that exactly, and strong states may in particular choose, for instance, to exercise power unilaterally or go through institutions. They're going to pick the one that makes the most sense from a realist perspective, on the realist view. But that doesn't mean they don't have choices, and doesn't mean those choices can't be assessed morally rather than just practically. Liberalism tends to use more domestic and individual level explanations, looks at domestic politics and the psychology or values of individuals to explain why states behave the way they do. And the domestic level and individual psychology can be constraining to some degree, but it also offers some maneuvering room for decisions, absolutely. And I would argue that there's a little bit more maneuvering room in liberalism than there is in the other two, although in constructivism there could be a fair amount of maneuvering room for powerful states to influence the norms that occur at the international level. So once again, I think this calls attention to the idea that the international context really offers us reasons to be careful about applying moral principles from the domestic context, right? Domestic governments clearly have choices, even though, of course, they too face constraints, but we can usually hold governments responsible for the outcomes of their actions. We can often hold governments responsible for their performance. They're not able to say the system made me do it, or at least if they do say that, we tend not to believe them. On the other hand, if systemic views are right, the maneuvering room in the international context is going to be more limited. And if realists are right, for example, then states must accumulate resources to fend off their challengers. And that's going to impose a constraint on how much choice they have about doing anything else but accumulate resources. If neo-realist or institutionalist views are right, then states might really want to address global climate change, but may not be able to, given the difficulty of enforcing emissions restrictions or even detecting those emissions in places like China or Brazil. That is to say, the lack of an enforcement mechanism is going to make people not want to be played by the rules. It's going to make people not trust one another, and of course, because the outcome depends on everybody limiting their emissions, if China, Brazil, and the United States and the European Union opt out, if any one of those five players opt out, it really wouldn't matter what the rest of the countries do together. And if even one of those players drops out, particularly China or the United States or the European Union, again, efforts to combat global climate change would almost certainly fail. And so the cooperation of all these actors is needed, but each actor has a very strong incentive to A, not trust the others, not trust their numbers, not trust their behavior or their motivations, and B, cheat themselves, because the others are likely to cheat as well. So these sorts of agreements are, in practice, very hard to keep together. So we have choices, but our choices are severely constrained, and what that means is that blame and praise are much more difficult to assign, particularly when systemic pressures are at play. It's hard to blame a country for seeking security through power if it really has to do that if it wants to survive. It's hard to blame a country for not joining a climate change agreement if that climate change agreement is unenforceable and essentially will be violated by whoever can violate it at the first available opportunity. So, once again, we have to be more careful in our attributions of praise and blame in the international context than perhaps in the domestic context.